Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in. So, today we are going to talk about the hottest news that everyone's talking about right now, which is DeepSeek. It's a model that seemingly has dethroned the kings of AI based in the US and has established Chinese supremacy over the AI industry. Of course, I'm being hyperbolic. It's a genuine innovation. It's a remarkable product that has been developed by a team, a very smart team in China. We're going to dive into all the details. If there's time at the end of this, I might do a more technical discussion of the actual model. But what I'd like to do here is I like to talk about the big ideas of tech. So if you like thinking about technology and its implications on how we should live our lives in society and politics and all of that kind of stuff, please consider subscribing to this channel. I'm a tech entrepreneur that founded a venture-backed company called Modular Cloud, and I make these videos because I like to talk about these topics. So if you like this video, if you like the topic of this video, please subscribe, please like this. And but anyway, let's dive in. So if in case any of you aren't aware, there's been a lot of hype around this model called DeepSeek that came out of China. So let me play a little video for you just so that you can see what I'm talking about in terms of the hype. I'll just play the beginning of this.
Last week, Chinese company DeepSeek shocked the world when they walked right over OpenAI's moat by releasing the open source R1 model. Not only does it beat their $200 O1 reasoning model, but it also beats Claude Sonnet and Gemini. It wins on key benchmarks, but more importantly, it passes my vibe test, along with many others on the internet, as long as you don't ask it what happened on April 15th, 1989. R1 even wins at math, which is crazy considering OpenAI had the answers in advance. Over the last few days, normies have been learning about R1, and it went viral to become the #1 app in America. This is a big problem for big tech, because in order for the grift to keep on grifting, artificial intelligence needs to be hard and take thousands of GPUs to pull off. But DeepSeek R1 cost less than $10 million and was actually the side project of a hedge fund where their only goal is to create long-term social value. Wall Street is terrified, and Nvidia stock is in for a bloodbath today. Nvidia has been the primary beneficiary of the AI boom, but the whole bubble just got one-shotted by a brutal reality check. In today's video, we'll find out how DeepSeek just changed the course of history. It is January.
Okay, that was the hypey intro, and just as a bit of a disclaimer on that, I think the fine folks at Fireship who make these very entertaining, short, digestible tech videos, I recommend that you check them out and subscribe to them. They, this was kind of a funny video. They exaggerate things and they joke around. So some of the claims that they made were maybe rumors or unsubstantiated things, and they kind of stretched the truth. But all in good fun. And but you get the idea. And this was the general sentiment of most people encountering how good this new AI model out of China was. So let me again go back and I'll just show you this chart. This is actually from the DeepSeek paper. If you see this chart here, so DeepSeek has several models, and we'll get into this. We'll break this all down. There's V3 and R1, and there's different variants of R1. And this is a side-by-side comparison of DeepSeek V3, DeepSeek R1, which is basically the improved version of V3, which we'll talk about all that. And as you can see, these dark lines are better than, of course, the V3 version of DeepSeek, which is, of course, worse. And then what's interesting is they compare this to OpenAI's O1 model. And when they do this comparison, you see that you don't need to necessarily overanalyze this chart. Like, don't get too caught up in the details of it, but look at how close these lines are. I mean, this is basically a model that has similar performance to the premier model put out by OpenAI. And there's some caveats to this. The first one being that OpenAI O1 is kind of like the dumbed well, it's just the version that uses less compute. It's like a distilled version. There is a O1 Pro, which is what I like to use as my favorite model, and it's far better than O1. And this is not comparing DeepSeek R1 to O1 Pro. This is comparing it to O1 regular. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And another thing to keep in mind is that OpenAI has O3, and they have an O3 Pro, and they have a lot of stuff in the works as well as that. So all that is to say, this is not a Chinese lab making a model that is better than the best US model. That is not what happened. Actually, something else happened, which is, in a sense, even more concerning for the US people. So, yes, technically speaking, this model is it performs as much as a top tier model from a US company, but maybe not as good as the best one. But the cost of running this model is very, very low. And the cost of training the model is very, very low compared to how much US players have spent. So let me see if I can find this, this tweet. So R1, this is by Gavin Baker, who is a managing partner at Atreides Management, which I think is a VC firm or some kind of private equity firm. They do crossover strategy. The crossover strategy? Weird. I guess that means that they invest in both private and public companies. But either way, point is, R1 costs 93% less to use than O1 for the same similar figure. And also, we're going to get into the details of this, but training R1 only costed around $6 million. And so if you look at all these recent funding rounds, actually, I didn't make this content big. I apologize for that. But so I'll make this content big. And I'll go back in case I wasn't showing it when it was big. Here are the performance. This is the performance graphics that I was intending to show. And then, let's go back to, and then let's go back here. So this is a tweet by Gavin Baker, and it says, R1 costs 93% less to use than O1. So this is huge. So this is an order of magnitude improvement in the cost of the model. So once R1 got built, it was an order of magnitude cheaper. And I'm not sure exactly how much the training runs for top of the line state-of-the-art models are normally, but $6 million is also a lot cheaper than it costs to build. So just to make sure this is all clear for you, so you understand the full picture. It is DeepSeek did two amazing things, and kind of three, depending on how you want to look at it. One, they trained a model for only $6 million, which is a very low amount to train a model. A state-of-the-art model. You can train a model for $6 million easily, but to have it get that type of top-tier performance for only $6 million, that is very impressive. And then two is that when you use that model, it is an order of magnitude cheaper. So, some people were saying that the comparing certain APIs, AI inference APIs to the DeepSeek one, it was a 30 times improvement in cost. So each token was 30 times less expensive. So this basically allowed people who were on a budget, and at some point, everyone's on a budget, to do way more compute and use AI way more, and not even worry about it. And so if you kind of have been keeping up with O1 has been a big success. It's a very powerful model. It's been, I subscribe to the OpenAI Pro plan, which is $200 per month. And with that, you can use the O1 Pro. And so OpenAI is actually, Sam Altman said that they are losing money on that. That's how expensive it is to run the O1 Pro model. And now, of course, we have to compare apples to oranges here. R1 is more comparable to O1. The DeepSeek Chinese one is more comparable to the lesser model from OpenAI. However, still, it shows at a time when OpenAI is bleeding cash, this Chinese lab came up with a model that essentially is just vastly cheaper and vastly more efficient and is really, really good. So let's dive into some of the details of this, so that we can see what is going on here. So how does R1 work at a high level? We're not going to go too deep into it. What were the innovations, and what was, and like, let's break down this cost thing a little bit further. But before we do that, I want to tell you my overall take on this. This is impressive. But it is not the most impressive thing we've ever seen by any chance, by any stretch of the imagination. This is just a run-of-the-mill, good, old-fashioned innovation. They've done a great job. They are one of many really good AI teams. And there's some mythology surrounding this story. We'll debunk some of that. But this does not concern me in the slightest bit in terms of the balance of power between US and China. A lot of people are being very, they're saying, oh, it's over. US tech has been destroyed by this. China is dominating. This is all hyperbole. This is absolutely something we would expect to happen. We could have predicted this. This is this is not any, basically, this is a great advancement, but it's not new information that fundamentally changes anything that we've already thought about this. And so I want to go through that argument, talk about DeepSeek in particular, and how this, why this is true, why DeepSeek is not concerning for US persons. And then after that, what I want to do is I want to talk more about the actual US versus China dynamic. So we'll get into that a bit later. So, okay, let's talk more about this. So, So first of all, what costs $6 million? This is a really important thing to understand. So it costs $6 million, which is very cheap. So as Gavin was saying, I can actually make this a little bit bigger. I think that's probably helpful. There we go. So that if you are seeing my screen, it's going to be bigger on the screen. So R1 costs 93% less to use than O1. So the Chinese model is very good. And it also was trained for $6 million, which is really good. And to be clear, why that's good is not because $6 million is low, but it's good because $6 million is low for a state-of-the-art model. I mean, just the fact that they could even make a state-of-the-art model, something that has really good metrics that's in line with the leaders, is impressive already. Now, others have done this. This is not something that is unthinkable, but it's impressive. It's very impressive. Okay. But as Gavin points out, the actual inference gain of efficiency is almost more impressive than the training figure. But let's go through this. So what exactly costs $6 million? Well, let's see. Do I have another resource on this? Okay. This is the founder of Stable Diffusion. So this is a guy who has released one of the leading open source models in the past. And he's one of the pioneers in generative AI and people who really made one of the first big companies outside of OpenAI to commercialize this technology. So he knows what he's talking about. This guy is very cool. So what he's saying here is that a lot of people are thinking about how R1 costs $6 million. That's not exactly the right way of thinking about it. Actually, there's two models. One is called DeepSeek V3, and there's one which he calls V3, and there's one called R1. Now, there's more than just these models. There's also variants of these models, but what let's just think of this as there being two models, V3 and R1. And essentially, the way that you need to think about this is that V3 is similar to, you can think of it like ChatGPT 4 as an example. Yeah, he compares it to 4.0. So this is a general model that basically is pre-trained. They call it pre-training. So you feed it a bunch of internet text or a bunch of high quality text, and it trains on this, and it learns how to predict the next word. And so you have these things called pre-training and post-training. So, and then there's also training, just regular training. But so if you kind of think about something like ChatGPT, how would this work? You have the GPT-4 model as the base. And so how do they make GPT-4? Essentially, they trained it on a bunch of text on the internet and maybe books and some other stuff. They have this corpus of data. So they have this transformer architecture, and they run all this data through it. And they use, big data centers. They spend lots of money in GPUs, and they make a model that basically can predict the next word. So you type in maybe the beginning of your essay as a prompt, and then this model will complete your essay and just keep predicting more words and more words from there. That's what you could consider a pre-trained base model. And so there's things like Llama, there's things like GPT-4, there's all these different pre-trained base models. And so this is a costly thing to do. And because you have to basically run a bunch of internet data on a bunch of GPUs and train a neural network to be able to be good at predicting. So what's really cool is that they were able to do this by making a lot of interesting optimizations. And so one such optimization is they use something called, I'm going to butcher this now. Oh no. Mixture of experts. Let me just even see. You go on stream and then you say something and then you start doubting yourself. Let's just call it mixture of experts. Yeah, I'm sure it's mixture of experts. So they use this thing called mixture of experts, and basically, it's actually a well-known architecture that has already been explored. It's a design space that's been explored. I think actually it was invented by the same guy. Well, at least maybe he was on the team who even came up with this idea. The same guy that also was put forward transformers and proposed transformers as an original architecture. So this has originated by people at Google and from Americans essentially, but they applied this in a very intelligent way, and they had other cool breakthroughs that basically were things that were already known, but they did it really well. And they also, since they didn't necessarily have as many resources as some other labs, one could make an argument that they were forced to think more about performance as opposed to just kind of pushing the gas and doing the one thing that they've already proven. They had to kind of iterate and think outside the box a little bit. So let me go here. And so people were, initially very skeptical about how could they have made DeepSeek V3 with such good performance. Let's listen to a bit of controversy. This is Alexander Wang, the CEO of Scale AI, basically stating that they had lots of GPUs. And so just before we listen to this, I want to contextualize this conversation. At the time, we were seeing really good performance from DeepSeek V3 and DeepSeek R1. Everyone was blown away by these results. It was top of the line. And basically what they were saying out of China is, one, they had very few GPUs, and they were way more efficient in how they built this than US labs. That's what people were saying. The other thing that people were saying is that the US put expert export controls on GPUs. So GPUs could not be exported into China. So it was kind of like there was almost like a rhetorical purpose to saying this, because the implication is that necessity breeds invention. And the fact that basically you can try to restrict imports and exports to China for GPUs, but the Chinese engineers are just so smart, they're going to overcome this, and they're going to then have, because they don't have the GPUs, they're going to come up with way better algorithms for actually building AI that's just way more efficient. So basically, it's almost like it was almost kind of like propaganda, the way that some people were saying it, propaganda against the idea of export controls of GPUs. And I'm against GPU export controls, but I also do understand that even though I don't agree that we should ban GPU exports to China, there are people in China who also agree with me that they shouldn't, but they are still, maybe putting forth narratives in order to discredit that US policy choice. And I may not agree with the US policy choice, but I also can see what they're doing. And so I was catching on to that at this time. And so what happened is that was the context, and everyone was wondering, how could they have trained a model for only $6 million with basically much worse GPUs than other firms were using to build such state-of-the-art models? And in that context, this interview came out. Let's listen to it.
The Chinese labs, they have more H100s than people think. And these
are the highest powered NVIDIA chips that they were not supposed to have.
Yes. My understanding is that DeepSeek has about 50,000 H100s, which they can't talk about, obviously, because it is against the export controls that the United States has put in place. And I think it is true that, I think they have more chips than other people expect, but also on a go-forward basis, they are going to be limited by the chip controls and the export controls that we have in place. The Chinese labs, they have more H100s than people think.
So when this happened, basically everyone thought, oh yeah, this is propaganda. They're lying. That's what a bunch of people jumped to this conclusion. Like they thought, okay, they actually did have access to H100s. And I believe this is a credible claim. This makes a lot of sense that maybe not that DeepSeek necessarily literally could use 50,000 NVIDIA H100s. Maybe there's reasons why they couldn't use it for this purpose, but they theoretically do have access to this. I think that's a believable claim. And it's definitely also believable that China has been able to circumvent US sanctions and export controls. It's just a reasonable assumption. I mean, they have a lot of power, a lot of regional influence, and there's a lot of things that they can do to get over this. So I have, let me see if I have this tweet. I might have not pulled this up. I should have. Oh no, why didn't I pull this up? I really should have. Let me go. I'm trying to, how do I do this? Here we go. I'm going on my Twitter. It's weird when the interface is so big. So I'm going here, looking here. So for example, this guy, he seems like an insider. I'm not actually sure who this is, but he's talking about how there are, certain Chinese AI companies that are very well funded and very well resourced. Not all Chinese companies are lean. But it does happen to be true that DeepSeek is absolutely like very exceptional. And they're very smart guys. And yeah, where is this other tweet by Imad Mustak? Here we go. He has done a lot of work showing that he believes that the numbers line up with what you would expect. And other people have, replicated a lot of the results. And basically at this point, we are sure that they were telling the truth. So like, as you can see here, like Austin here thinks that perhaps they were lying and they made DeepSeek V3/R1 by spending a lot more money, just like OpenAI did. And let's not go down this path, because I think that this is just very well corroborated by the evidence. There's way more interesting things to talk about. At this point, it is very well established that they are at least 99% telling the truth, because everything they're saying lines up and it all makes sense, and everything has been replicatable and there has been absolutely no red flags. Now, it may be true that they've had access to GPUs there, but just because they had access did not mean that they used them. And so both of these things can be true at the same time. And it also can be true that there are certain people that have a vested interest in putting forth certain narratives about export controls, and those people have mythologized and spun this to make it into make it seem like export controls are completely pointless because that's in their interest. So I think all of these things are true. But let's continue to understand what really happened here. So they were a team that maybe could have accessed more GPUs, but there were some limitations on the GPUs that they had access to. They were a smart group of determined individuals who had funding to work on this problem, and they iterated and they explored a well-traveled, maybe that's a better way of putting it, idea space. They relied on a lot of established architectures and a lot of established research, and they made their own pre-trained large language model. And this model, and so they made their own pre-trained large language model, and this model, which is called DeepSeek V3, was quite good. And it was in line with, it is maybe slightly worse, but similar to other top-of-the-line models. So that was cool. And there's no reason to believe that an American company couldn't necessarily do that. There's just not that many teams that have access to even $6 million for training, and that are funded and are able to iterate on this problem and think about it. So it makes sense that nobody has gone down this exact path. A lot of the talent is getting sucked up into these larger companies, and they may be focused on solving problems in a slightly different way, not being as resource aware. They might be more willing to burn resources and put emphasis on solving different problems. But to be clear, like where we are in this journey of developing AI has been a series of really amazing breakthroughs after breakthroughs for the past 10 years at least. And long before that, there's been other breakthroughs, maybe not as frequent, but then in the past 10 years, there's just been breakthrough after breakthrough after amazing revelation after amazing revelation. So like the amount that, for example, OpenAI has pushed things forward is so much greater than this one thing. It's not even comparable. But this is cool. I mean, and there have been lots of teams that have entered the space and really done things well. I mean, I'm thinking about, Stable Diffusion was really cool for its time. And Midjourney they have really pushed image generation into amazing heights. They have an incredible moat. There's Claude. Claude has been able to surpass on many metrics. Anthropic, meaning the developers of Claude, they've been able to surpass OpenAI. Meta has come forth with a lot of innovations. Like all these companies are fantastic. They're fantastic. And but they're not going to all. There's a lot of discoveries to be made, and not everybody is going to discover everything. So you're going to expect, when you have more people enter into the space, you're going to expect to have a variety of different discoveries in different locations. It could be in China, it could be in the East Coast of the US or the West Coast of the US. There's nothing, fundamentally unexpected by basically having a relatively efficient way to develop an LLM. Like these were all ideas that were out there, and there's not much there are not many specific things that came about that to like they didn't come up with a very large amount of original things. They did things properly. They iterated. They got it just right. It takes many different attempts. You try, you search through a lot of solutions, and eventually you stumble upon something. So it only stands to reason that a team like themselves that were smart and well-resourced were able to do it. And also, it's true that these engineers were very good at finding, like optimizing code and making things run in a performant way. It's true. But it also stands to reason that if you are a relatively less resourced team, that it does stand to reason that you are going to be finding the type of innovations that really make things more efficient. That's what you are going to specialize in, because there's no way that you would be able to discover the types of innovations that would, for example, push things forward at the frontier of compute. Like there's a lot of things, if you have the biggest data center, there's other things you can try. And you just have a different set of constraints. So you will be, if that's your circumstance, you're very well funded, you have tons of GPUs, you're going to be focused on finding problems that you can solve with those resources. You're not going to you could focus on finding efficient, ways of being more efficient. But if you are a lab that's less resourced, that's the only thing you have, is to figure out how to do things while being efficient. That's the only option. So if you grant that, having multiple teams across the world working on these types of problems is going to lead to discoveries within all of these different teams and these different locations, if you grant that that is true, then it's exactly what you would expect. There are going to be gains to be had. There are going to be ways of being more efficient, and those are going to be discovered, and they're probably going to be discovered by the people who are focused on finding efficiency gains, which would be the teams that are less resourced. This is exactly what you would expect. And so what would be really concerning for US labs is if none of these ideas had been talked about. This was a completely unexplored space. Everything was fundamentally different. And even if they shared all the details and we could be in awe at how novel this approach was, that would be concerning. And imagine if they didn't even share the details, that would be even more concerning, because now we don't even know what they're doing. But that's just not the case. The fact of the matter is that they made a model that was good, not the best, but good. And they did it in a way that was more efficient. And this was just a relatively underexplored sub-question in the field of LLM development. And so furthermore, I think this is a good thing for US teams, actually, because what this does is it does validate the idea that a smaller, less funded team is able to make significant breakthroughs in this space. So now there probably has been a reluctance to fund smaller teams, because the idea has just been, basically there's been a consolidation into the big players with Google and OpenAI and Microsoft and Meta and X, etc. And there's been a consolidation because you've assumed that you need huge clusters. But what this shows, and it should have been obvious, but it wasn't, what this shows is that actually there is room to work on the lower end of the resource spectrum. And I think what's going to happen now is a lot of teams are going to come in and they're going to try to find these similar types of gains. And they're going to be based in Europe, they're going to be based in the US, and it's going to crowd out people like the DeepSeek team who basically had low-hanging fruit at the time. And I don't mean to say this in order to diminish what they did. What they did was impressive. It was amazing. But there's lots of companies that come out with amazing stuff that is better in many ways. And so essentially what they did is they were better in two ways. One, they had a more efficient, not better, but a more efficient base model, which is DeepSeek V3. And two, they were able to enhance DeepSeek V3's abilities through the methods that they use to construct the R1 model. And this is something called post-training. And this is, so everyone does post-training, but essentially they use techniques that were modifications of existing techniques, and specifically this was in regards to reinforcement learning. And they did things that were achieved in other contexts. Like a lot of people are comparing this to AlphaGo and a lot of the work that Google has done with reinforcement learning. And their architecture is an adaptation of the architecture used by OpenAI. And we could go into the technical details, and I will shout out to a great video that really breaks down all of this stuff. But maybe at the end, I'll just preview that really quick to you guys. But there's nothing fundamentally new here. This is just standard innovation, taking things that have been talked about, proven in other contexts, combining them properly, getting it right, and just making it work. And when you make it work, sometimes you get really great results, and they did. They got really great results. But at the end of the day, this is exactly, as I was saying, what you would expect. So let me just see what else there is here. This one was talking about the performance, but I think we kind of understand. So let me just kind of pull this up, because this is an interesting way of categorizing the performance. So as you can see, O1 is the leader. So O1 is essentially built on GPT 4.0, but where is that? I'm not seeing that here. Okay, GPT 4.0 here. So O1 is basically applying the chain of thought technique to GPT 4.0. So this is like the base model. This is like V3. And then this is the refinement, which basically makes higher quality answers. So they did two things. They made DeepSeek V3, which is comparable to GPT 4.0. Here it's looking like it's ranked higher, but mostly I think people think that technically GPT 4.0 is better than DeepSeek V3. But on a per cost basis, it's not. And then what they did was they improved it in a way that was a lot cheaper as well. And so they didn't really make something better, but they improved it. So R1 is comparable to O1, and V3 is comparable to GPT 4.0. Okay, so that's cool. That's all very cool. But as I was saying, essentially, my view is that, sorry, one second, let me just adjust this. Let me adjust this layout. My view is that this is what we would expect. There was not a fundamental innovation here. This was just getting things right. This is what innovation looks like. And the fact that this is a lab in China has raised a lot of flags. It's made people very nervous because they perceive the US to be in a competition with China. And this should be welcomed. I think people should be very thankful to this team for making this open source. This is very cool. I'm a big fan of open source models. We really don't want this stuff to be gatekept by these large corporations that are basically going to collect data on us. And I'm not so worried per se about what the corporation may or may not do, but you also have to realize that when you're stuck in this type of an apparatus, now it could be exploited to target you. So if you are dependent on using OpenAI and you're putting all your sensitive information in there, now state actors and other malicious actors can extort or hack OpenAI and come after you. It's another vector of vulnerability. Whereas if you're able to use a local model, you are insulated from a lot of potential harms that can come to you. So I'm a big fan of open models. So first of all, we need to thank them. Second of all, I want to make the case to you that the US does not need to be worried about China. I don't think that this is something that we should be concerned about. I don't think we should be planning on going to war with China. I think we should be trading more with China. Trading with China has made China rich. It's made us rich. It's been good. It's been a productive relationship. And we should, I don't believe that we should try to get China into a long, protracted war in Taiwan. I think that would be a mistake. I don't like, basically, it's people will talk about doing the Ukraine strategy where Russia invades Ukraine. We fund the rebels in Ukraine, and Russia then bleeds out resources and spends a bunch of time fighting in this war and gets dragged down. I don't think that that's a good thing. We should not be doing that in China. And here's why. So some people say, well, war is always bad and we just need to not have war. And so it's fundamentally illegitimate to do something like that. And that's why. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that I have a like ideological opposition to the US being in a conflict with China. I think it's totally possible to have a great power struggle, and China is a great power. They're great in their power. I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily put them on par with the US, but they deserve the utmost respect. That's not why though. I'm not just a perma-dove person who's completely. I used to be like a hardcore libertarian, and I would have been for ideological reasons opposed to war. But in this case, I wouldn't say purely practical because that's very cold-hearted. I also, from a humanitarian standpoint, I don't think it's good. Basically, so first of all, war would be very bad for both the US and China. It would just be very bad. People would die. It would be very sad. And then even if you said, okay, well, that's what needs to happen, and we could do it in a way where it's really, we're fighting by proxy in Taiwan, and so that would not be as bad because there wouldn't be boots on the ground or something along those lines. This would still be terrible because there'd be a bunch of Chinese people dying, a bunch of Taiwanese people dying, and this is like people that are very closely related, very similar. It'd be very sad, and it would basically destroy Taiwan as a location. It would destroy a lot of people's homes. It would be a horrible thing. I'm not in favor of that. I don't have if Taiwan wants to be independent, I respect that. I want to be of help, but I also am not looking for a fight. That's all I'm saying. I think that we need to do the right thing. It may involve, I'm not saying there's never going to be any need for military intervention in this situation, but we shouldn't be looking for a fight. There's no point. Now, there could be a point if the US was threatened. If the US was on the brink of basically being subjugated by China, if there was a threat where China would come and dominate us and exploit us and put us in a bad situation, even if there was a chance of that, not like inevitable, but it was even a risk of that, I would potentially I would certainly be in favor of taking action to prevent that. But that is just not at all the place that I think that we're in. I don't think that we have anything to worry about, actually. Unfortunately, because I think China is a great place and a great country, but things are not really looking good for China. And so this comes, in order to illustrate this, I want to circle this discussion around a debate between Balaji Srinivasan, who's someone who I've talked a lot about on this channel. A lot of my early videos were reacting to Balaji's stuff, and I think he's right about almost everything, but I think that he overestimates China's importance in the grand scheme of things. I think that's his one mistake. And I want to highlight a debate between Balaji Srinivasan and Peter Zeihan, who is basically a super China bear. He thinks China is going to collapse. China will cease to exist. He's very bearish. Now, with all these things, Balaji is very bullish on China, and he thinks China will overtake the U.S. unless the U.S. changes course. I think that there's no world in which China overtakes the U.S., but I still think the U.S. should change course, but not for that reason. And so Balaji is super bullish on China, and Zaihan is super bearish on China. And the truth is somewhere in between. Zeihan obviously exaggerates a bit too much in the things that he says, and demonstrably some of his predictions have not come true. So this is just self-evident. But with that said, he has a lot of really 100% accurate points. So we need to take that into consideration. So I want to dive into the bull case and the bear case. First, let's do the bear case. I'm going to show you a few clips, and then I'm going to give you some of my takes, and I'll kind of summarize things. And then let's see, given this perspective, how people are articulating the pro-China stance. And when I say pro-China, I don't mean I want what's best for China, because I'm pro-China in the sense that I want what's best for them. As humans on this planet, I want them to do well, and I want the U.S. to do well. I'm saying the pro-China stance as in China is going to destroy the U.S. Like you would bet on China. That's what I mean by that. So let's dive in to the content here. Okay, so let's watch this video by Peter Zeihan. I will add this to a playlist on my channel called Sources. So all the major videos that I react to, I add to the Sources playlist. So you can always, come and reference this great material. So let's watch.
Coming from Colorado, a lot of you have been writing and asking for scenarios.
I'm going to do this on 1x speed because, when you're playing back, you might want to do 2x because I'm not necessarily talking too fast. So I don't want there to be a mismatch in the speeds. So, okay, let's listen.
What the Chinese system will look like as it collapses. And Chinese history is rich with how it's all gone to hell. So
still going 2x. Sorry. Okay.
On one specific scenario, I don't think is very useful, but a lot of you have also written in asking about the Chinese housing market. And I think kind of exploring these two things hand in hand is worth a little bit of time. So the Chinese follow a capital-intensive investment model. There's three types of economic growth. You've got consumption, like you go out and you buy a home or you buy an iPod or whatever it happens to be. In the United States, that's about 70% of total economic activity, private consumption. Then you have exports. So, you make something like Boeing and you sell it to the Indians, export-led economic growth. That is a system that is more popular in a place like, say, Korea or Germany. And then you have investment-led economic growth, which is the building of stuff. Regardless of where you get the capital, you go out and you build a road, you build a factory, something like that. And this has always been the method that has been favored in China and to a lesser degree all of East Asia.
And so just to be clear, I don't think that he fully discusses what happens here. But in order to generate this investment, there's a lot of things that China does. And I'll just name two of them. One is, I'll name three of them, one of them in less detail. One thing that they do is they have very strict capital controls. So they are basically, when people earn excess income, they have very few options for what they can do with this. And essentially, the only option that they have is to reinvest it back into Chinese projects. And so, essentially, what's happening is internally in the system, there is an overabundance of capital available to fund projects. So this is like a monetary stimulus effect because it's like injecting capital into the system that's looking to chase a return. So that means if you have a projected return, there's so much capital competing for your project that you're going to have to pay less interest as a result of that. And this has a stimulatory effect. And so essentially, since investors, wealth holders in the country have no other option, they have to put their money into Chinese projects. And Chinese projects are all, in a sense, centrally managed by the state, either directly or indirectly. And there's different layers of obfuscation and there's different degrees of separation, but essentially it is all things that are approved and part of state initiatives. And then they're getting funded by the savings of the people in the country. And the problem with this is it creates a lot of leverage and overexposure to the Chinese economic conditions. So you work at a company that pays your salary in China. Then any excess money that you have is then put into another company that, pays someone else in China and does something else. And you're just singularly exposed to this one non-competitive market. And your only choice is to take any excess capital that you did not consume within China yourself and basically put it back into the system. So you can see how this is like a very loose monetary environment. So that's one thing. They have capital controls. The other thing they do is they do direct stimulatory loose monetary policy by manipulating their currency. So this has a very similar effect. So now people have, income and contracts and savings denominated in yuan. Well, the government is now directing new flows of yuan into places that they want them to go. So they're inflating, and they're basically preventing capital holders from accruing value, and they're putting new flows of their currency into new projects. So this is like a form of central planning. It's a form of stimulus. They're creating more capital in the system. They're not allowing deflation to occur. This is another thing that is stimulatory and levers up the system. And finally, the third thing, I don't remember what the third thing I was going to say was, but yeah, I'm not remembering what the third thing I was going to say was, but those are two of the big things that they do. So let's continue watching.
Because it's something the government, for the most part, can control, and it tends to be directed towards things that the government feels needs to be done. So roads, bridges, industrial plant. And all of the East Asians have followed this pattern to a certain degree. The problem with this pattern and this type of growth is if you do it enough, you start to distort the economy and you absorb more and more capital and more labor and more resources, and eventually you get to the point.
Oh yeah, now I remember the other thing I was going to say. There is this like shadow banking system in China, and there's these accounting problems that they have where they don't classify certain things as debt that actually are debt. So really, Chinese companies are way more over levered than you think. They have a lot more debt than you think that they have. And same with actually the government has a lot more debt. And this includes like local municipalities is very indebted, and they're backstopping local companies, and ultimately the kind of federal Chinese government is ultimately backstopping the municipalities. And so it's not as much of a direct stimulus, but there is government financing, first of all, which is easily available. And second of all, the accounting practices in some sense obfuscate the degree of leverage that is being taken in any given venture, which can have a bit of a stimulatory effect as well, because then external capital holders are not aware of the level of debt that these companies have. So you are also more likely to get foreign investment and stuff like that into your venture. Okay. Anyway, let's continue listening. But I wanted to also, before we continue listening to what he was saying, I wanted to also highlight this other fact about what he was saying is that a lot of this investment goes into things like roads and bridges. And so like the government the Chinese government decides what would be a good project that's beneficial for the economy, and they direct capital to build high-speed rails and power plants and like all this infrastructure that they're deciding needs to be built. That's how a lot of these projects actually get funded. And we'll talk about why this can lead to malinvestment shortly.
Point where there's diminishing returns because you only need so many roads, you only need so many factories. In the case of Japan, they reached this point in the 1980s, and they went from having stratospheric growth, because this generates a lot of economic activity, to just kind of a stall out. And they were left with a stack of loans worth about 50% of their GDP, $2 trillion at the time, that was invested into assets that probably should have never been built in the first place. And it took the Japanese system 30 years to churn through that. And that was 30 years of basically not having economic growth at all. Eventually, they realized the debt burden was so bad that they needed to focus what they could do on more productive stuff, and that turned out to be stuff that was not in Japan. And so we started this generation-long outsourcing, desourcing, whatever you want to call it, to countries that had better demographics and better debt profiles, most notably the United States. And here we are now, 35 years after that process started, and the Japanese economy is more or less back in health, but it's happened as the demographic situation is turned inside out. So consumption-led growth in Japan will probably never happen again. They're just too old. Something similar went down in Korea. But the Koreans attacked it with a fervor that the Japanese couldn't muster, and they decided to deal with it by investing more, but going further and further up the value-added chain. And this could work in Korea because they were already among the most highly educated populations in the world. And it eventually generated things like the Samsung and the Daewoo and the Hyundai that we know today. It came at a cost. Extraordinary levels of turnover in their corporate world, as entire chaebol, which are kind of giant industrial conglomerates, would go bust, which would generate a huge surge of unemployment and credit risk, which the government had to step in and assume the risk of itself. In China, it has done something similar to both of these, as well as a third one. So first, building bridges to nowhere. The Chinese absolutely reached that level probably back in the early 2010s, and most of the construction we've seen across China is of questionable economic use, and the debt has been building up.
We're going to talk more about this issue of building bridges to nowhere a bit later, but this is a big problem.
Corporate debt has basically doubled since 2010. And it started at a level that was already in excess of American debt. So, we're talking about a huge amount of money that has been put into things that probably are never going to have a return. They tried to follow the Korean model as well, but what they discovered is that their workforce was already fairly unproductive. And while overall productivity for the Chinese labor forces have gone up by 50 to 100% in the last 10 to 15 years, the debt load has gone up by a factor of 5. So from a cost-benefit point of view, Chinese labor has actually decreased in terms of its overall productivity once you consider the cost. Because in that time frame, the cost of Chinese labor has gone up by more than a factor of 5 or 6.
Yeah, and it's also important to keep in mind that there's now a lot of more enticing,
which are, for the most part, private enterprise-driven systems. The Chinese are absolutely state-centric. And in Korea and Japan, the people always had options for where to put their own personal money to make their bets on their futures, prepare for their own retirement, expand their own wealth. The Chinese don't have that. Capital flight is strictly regulated, in many cases forbidden, and every time that the people find a new way to get money out, the Chinese government changes the law, and so it all gets bottled up at home. Now, for the Chinese development model, this has proven successful at keeping the Chinese citizens' money as part of the process that then funds all of that investment. So whereas in Japan, it's a mix of corporate, and Korea, it's a mix of corporate and government, in China, the average citizen, in many ways, is being forced to help underwrite all this bad debt. And the Chinese citizens don't really appreciate that, as you might expect. And so they're always looking for outlets. Now, they can't send their money abroad, so they're looking for outlets at home. And so China is famous for massive speculative bubbles that happen in commodities or gold or anything. And the one that has proven the most problematic and the one that has generated the most economic growth to this point has been housing. The government does allow you to own your own home. So people do that with gusto. And then they started buying apartments and second apartments and third apartments and fourth apartments. And basically we got an Enron style financial boom driven by growth in construction of the housing sector. Now, the new news that has come.
Let's revisit this video in a second. Maybe we can finish watching it. But I want to just before we like go too deep into this, I want to kind of establish some theory here, like what's going on an economics level. And so I think one interesting thing is the Austrian business cycle. It sheds some light on this and explains it, I think, in an elegant way. I'm especially a big fan of Hayek, and there's this thing called the Hayekian triangle. And essentially, it shows how if you artificially lower interest rates, it creates what's called malinvestment. And it leads people to make investment decisions that are not otherwise advisable, let's say. And I will play a video, but let me just give you like a very short rule of thumb on this. Like think about if you can invest money now and you think it's going to have a huge payoff in the future, you're more likely to do that. And so if essentially by lowering interest rates, you are giving a signal that you're going to have a low discount on the future. That means that future dollars are worth a lot more than present dollars. And so what you do is you actually shift the time scale upon which people are making consumption and investment-based decisions. And so it makes a lot of long-term investments look a lot more attractive than they otherwise should be. And so what happens is you make all of these long-term investments. And the idea is kind of that, like, imagine there's a bunch of people that are saving their money. There's a huge population that's saving their money. And in the future, there's going to be some kind of, let me just put myself on the big screen. In the future, they're saving their money. In the future, they're going to retire and they're going to spend a lot of money. Imagine this scenario. So what you would want to do is that these people are going to, right now they're productive, and in the future they're going to be unproductive consumers because they're going to retire. What you'd want to do is you want to build out long-term projects that cater to these people when they retire. So you want to have that capacity. Like, let's say you want to automate away their jobs when they retire so that now there's nobody working, but now you still need to feed them. So let's say they worked on a farm and they're going to retire. You'd want the farm to be automated by the time they retire so that you can still continue to feed them and feed their consumption. And, but of course that takes capital. So what if you had, let's just say you're in isolation on a farm, you had the capacity to invest in automation, but you also didn't need to. It's your choice on if you wanted to do that. But you have a bunch of people that are currently working, so you don't need automation now. You need automation when they retire. So what would happen? Well, these people, they would work on the farm, they get paid. They would need to eat, but they would know that they need to save for the future because at some point they're going to stop working on the farm in the future. So what would they do? They would save for the future. And then what this would do, and this kind of goes into banking and the business cycle, but essentially saving in a sense is actually a force that lowers interest rates. And the reason is because it basically increases the supply of money available to lend or to finance projects, because savings is essentially the same as investment. And like you put your retirement savings in your 401k, you're putting that into equities, or it's going to the bank and they're creating loans based on that collateral. All that, we don't need to get into the details of that. The point is that what would happen is on this farm, people would have the excess capital. They know they need to save for when they're not working. So they would save. There'd be all this money available in the savings pool, and that would be invested into a long-term project to automate farming. And so then by the time these people retire, then the farm automation would be complete, and now they could just spend their money and enjoy the fruits of that automated labor, and they would be able to still continue to be fed. And there's nuance to this, but actually, like, it's a very elegant system. And in a sense, the time scale upon which they need to withdraw that money is going to actually affect the interest rate, and the projects, the degree of farm automation will be determined in part based off of these types of preferences. So it's a very cool system. So let me just give you I think this was a very nice intro explanation of the Austrian business cycle by Tom Woods. It's just a pretty short video. We may or may not watch the whole thing, but he will give you a elegant, well-spoken summary of the Austrian business cycle.
And what I want to do is just say a couple of things briefly about so-called fiscal stimulus and then monetary stimulus. In fact, I think I'll actually do them in the reverse order, to show that, of course, we should expect these things are only going to prolong the agony of a depression. Now, for the monetary part, let me not assume that everybody in the room knows Austrian business cycle theory. A lot of people are coming to this for the first time in recent months or in the past 18 months or 2 years. And so I don't want to assume that you know that. Or if I say there have been misallocations of resources, how did that happen? So let me give the really, really stripped down Reader's Digest version. And for those of you in the room who are experts who are saying, I can't believe he didn't talk about the, well, you're right, and I deserve that rebuke, but I'll happily take an extra 15 minutes, but Doug French will never let me speak at one of these again. So just please just be patient with me. Let's just give the stripped down version. It basically goes like this. What Hayek was arguing in his important writing in the 1930s was that interest rates actually play a role in the economy. They're not just arbitrary numbers. They play a coordinating function. And when they are permitted to play this coordinating function, what they do is they coordinate production across time. So that is to say, when we save more and interest rates consequently decline, that is the very time that it makes sense for businesses to produce goods and to engage in projects that are going to bear fruit in the future. Because when we save more, we're basically saying, I'm going to consume this portion of my income in the future. Well, that's the future that businesses are investing for. And why are they investing now? Because the interest rates are low. And the longer term their production project is, the more interest rate sensitive it is. So it's going to give a disproportionate stimulus to longer term types of investments. So the interest rate then coordinates this. My desire to consume in the present versus the future, and businesses' production processes oriented toward the present versus the future. Secondly, the very fact that I'm saving, that I've earned my money and have not returned back into the economy to take that money and claim all the resources to which, in a sense, I'm entitled, I'm actually leaving some of those resources out there in the economy. Well, my deferral of consumption, my releasing of resources into the economy provides the material wherewithal to see all the new business projects undertaken by investors through to completion. So again, now the interest rate is coordinating this as well, in effect, the supply of real saved resources in the economy. And what Hayek said is that when you tamper with the structure of interest rates as the market sets them, you are introducing discoordination into this coordinating structure. So now, if the central bank, like the Federal Reserve, simply says, we're going to force interest rates down through our open market operations, the problem here is that in this case, the public has not necessarily indicated they want to consume in the future. They want to consume right now. They might want to consume even more right now. But yet, businesses are still being encouraged to engage in long-term investment. So people are demanding more of existing goods right now, but yet investors are being misled into engaging in long-term product development for new products in the future. It's a time mismatch. Likewise, if just because Ben Bernanke or Alan Greenspan says, hey, we're going to...
Those are the former chairmen. Sorry, I don't know why I'm speaking wrong. Former Fed chairmen.
Force interest rates down. That doesn't release any more resources into the economy. So you have an unchanged resource pool to fund a whole bunch of new investment projects. Well, how are you going to do that? They can't all be completed. So there's going to be a bust that comes. So this is the super duper, really fast overview of this. So that's why simply saying, let's create more money and let's jolt that money into the banking system and keep interest rates down, that's not a solution to a depression. That's the cause of the depression. That's what gets people onto these unsustainable investment trajectories. And if you continue to do it, all you're doing is encouraging people to continue building things that ultimately can't be finished or won't be profitable, or there won't be sufficient consumer demand to in effect, rationalize these investments at the end. So that's a super duper duper stripped down version of the theory. So there are implications here about what you should do during a depression. Again, stop the money creation. Now, Mises' example that he uses in Human Action of the master builder who's building a house, but he's under a misleading impression of how many bricks he has. He thinks he's got 20% more bricks than he has, and let's say he can't buy anymore. He starts building the house, but he's building a different kind of house than he would have built if he had known the real supply of saved resources in his microeconomy. So he's building a house that he won't be able to finish. So if we say to him, well, in fact, let's think of it this way. What would be the best way to get this builder out of his predicament? It would be to alert him, you're building a house that you won't be able to finish, and alert him as soon as possible. Don't wait till he's at the last brick and say, that was the last brick. Because now he's got to demolish the whole building. Now he's squandered all those resources. Now he's wasted all that labor time, and he has made society poorer. So we see, first of all, from this example, that the boom period, the period where he's building the house, he's got employment, everything looks great, that's where the damage is done. The recession period, when he realizes, whoa, I'm doing something unsustainable. I'm wasting resources. I'm wasting labor time. That's the return to health. And so likewise, now let's think of that in terms of the economy as a whole. If producers are engaged in projects, the economy as a whole is on a series of investment trajectories that are unsustainable in the long run, it's better that it find that out right now and that it not find it out in the distant future. So in effect, the analogy I've used is when people say the solution is let's pump more money in the economy, let's put interest rates way down, let's put them down to zero. In fact, zero is too high. We're even hearing from some people, zero is too high. Whatever that means, whatever they want to do with that. But when they say that, what they're really saying is that the way out of the master builder's dilemma is that we should just get this guy drunk. Just liquor him up so he doesn't notice the dwindling supply of bricks. He just keeps on. He's having a great old time. But does that hold off the bust? The bust is inevitable. So likewise, by saying, just keep pouring in more money, that doesn't change the fact that you've got an unsustainable structure. And when Alan Greenspan did exactly this in 2001, when he started, with all these rate cuts and we're going to just get things going again, and he refused to let that recession take its course, and that healthy process whereby these unsustainable investments are stopped and they stop impoverishing us, and those resources are reallocated into sustainable projects, he wouldn't let that happen. And that's the first recession on record in which housing starts did not decline. And it's right at that time that people therefore drew the false conclusion, the Fed-fueled conclusion that, everything goes bust in a recession apparently except housing. Housing prices never go down. A house is the best investment you can make. You should make a living flipping houses because that's an easy way to make money. All those myths get started right at that time because Greenspan is trying to hold off the recession by keeping the master builder liquored up. But now the master builder is on the last brick. And so the recession is all the worse. So we shouldn't look back at 1920 and say, what a big surprise. The Fed didn't try to keep the bubble going, and yet somehow the economy got out of it. No. It's because the Fed didn't try to do that.
Okay, that's enough. I think you can see the parallels. I'm going to add this to my sources playlist, just so you know. You can find it there on my channel if you want to revisit this very good explanation. And shout out to Tom Woods and the Mises Institute. And this is a libertarian perspective. But I think it's not, you don't have to be libertarian to see the value in this. There's a lot of truth to this. You can quibble on certain details. I'm fine with that. But there's a lot of truth to this framing of things. You can argue in the details, but and we're going to come back to this libertarian perspective a bit later because Balaji is a libertarian and we're going to talk about his perspective. But let's get there in due time. So, okay. Now, armed with this knowledge, we see how essentially the Chinese government is creating a condition where, similar to these savers, they're for artificially forcing capital to chase these long-term projects. And they're actually deciding which projects, centrally planning a lot of the projects that get created. Like they're deciding, we want high-speed rails, we want a power plant, we want a bridge, etc. Right? And they're funneling this money, forcing this money to chase a project. There's an excess of income, and they're forcing this money to be reinvested. And they're limiting the degree to which people can spend it because they're not allowing them to take it out of the country. And they're essentially fueling the biggest, I mean, this is the theory of people like Zeihan, is that they're essentially funding the greatest malinvestment known to man. Never has there been such a giant infrastructure and real estate boom as what they have here. Like, we've had a housing boom in 2008. And this is kind of what Tom Woods was referencing, with where we ended up in a bad place because of our loose monetary policy. We got into a bad place and we had a great recession in 2008. China's issues are so much worse. They have been basically operating a giant Ponzi scheme for decades, and they've been doubling down on it because it would be very bad if it crashed. Now, so just remember this, like, the thesis is that they are the perpetrators of the greatest malinvestment in human history, and there is an infrastructure and real estate bubble of epic proportions. And there's more problems too, but we'll get to those. That's the thesis. But let's continue watching Zeihan's video, Armed with This Knowledge, and just finish out his thoughts on this matter.
Come out in just the last few days that kind of crystallized this all for me. So there's a dude in China by the name of He King, great name, who used to be an uppity up in the Chinese Statistics Bureau. And his estimate now is that there's more housing units available that are unoccupied in China, so many available, that they could house the entire Chinese population. So we're talking an overbuild in excess of 100%. Quick addendum, I did a quick fact check before we went to print with this one. Print, release, whatever, on Mr. He's data that he estimates that there are sufficient empty apartments to house the entirety of the Chinese population. That was wrong. He says there's sufficient spare housing to house twice the Chinese population. So everything I said before stands, just underline most of it. To kind of put that into perspective, the American subprime crisis at its peak had less than 5% overbuild because of subprime, probably closer to 3%. And it was only because we bound up those mortgages with more healthy real estate investments in asset-backed securities that it actually turned into a big crisis. And we all know how that felt here. Ultimately, we had a financial crisis that lopped 5% off of GDP. If in China you're talking 100% overbuild, in a country that is suffering from the advanced stages of terminal demographic decline and is already experiencing massive population losses.
We will talk about this.
Against in the United States, where we had less than a 5% overbuild and we still had population growth and inward migration. The mind reels in coming up with a historical precedent here, because there isn't one. In time, the Korean, the Japanese models were able to mostly recover from the overbuild, in part because private citizens were not wrapped up in the damage. This time around in China, this specific aspect of the overbuild, which is the biggest in human history, isn't even reflected in the debt data, because a lot of Chinese have been able to pay for these apartments with cash, and they now have invested, for the most part, their total life savings in an asset that is probably worth at most a quarter of what they paid for it. So in Japan, in Korea, national coherence, public support for the very existence of the government was never damaged, because people's finances were only hit indirectly because of economic growth issues. But in China, you're talking about a complete wipeout for what for most Chinese citizens is their primary and maybe even only method of savings, on top of a failure of the Korean-style expansion to improve productivity, on top of a failure of the Japanese-style program to improve public infrastructure. This is going to hit them from every possible angle when it breaks, and it's going to do so by ripping the heart out of public support for the entire system and the CCP and the government in particular. So no, I am not particularly optimistic about how this is going to shake out.
Okay, so I think you can start to see his argument here. Basically, China is super over-levered. They've just created a bubble of epic proportion. They have done the greatest malinvestment of all time, and they've built up a ton of infrastructure, and particularly one of these subsections of infrastructure, housing, although it's not just housing that's the problem. And they've built up a bunch of useless infrastructure that they don't actually need. And which in a sense is sad, because they generated so much wealth and then they've squandered it on the wrong things. And so, and we'll get into further problems with this. I want to go into even more problems that China is facing. We haven't even talked about some of the worst problems that China is facing. But you might not believe me. You might be like, oh, this is hyperbole. This is an exaggeration. They're not doing this. What are you talking about? Okay, let me show you examples of this. So I actually haven't watched this video, so we can react to this together. But there's this thing called ghost cities. Just look it up. Just look it up. It's textbook malinvestment. It's exactly what he's saying. There's all these vacant apartments. He was talking about this. It's even worse than you think. It's entire cities that are, it's literally giant Ponzi schemes that everyone knows is the Ponzi scheme, and they just don't let it keep it going. They don't let it collapse because it would be so bad and so catastrophic if these things got wiped out. And remember what Tom Woods was saying. He was saying the longer you go, the worse it is. You want to correct as soon as possible. The more you prolong it, the worse the damage is. Well, look what's happening. Let's watch this. Let's react together to this video about ghost cities.
Of China.
Oh wait, just really quick. I added both of those to the playlist. Okay, if this is good, I'll add it to the playlist. If it's not, then I won't.
What you see here is myself and Lau86 standing in a ghost city in Liaoning province. This isn't the only ghost city we visited, however. Here in Hunan, you can drive for hundreds of miles, and on each side of the road you will see multiple...
I also just want to pause here for a second to emphasize my point. Remember, my point in showing you this is that if you doubt that malinvestment occurs, after you just talked about the type of bubble and malinvestment that happens, this really, like, whatever doubts you may have about specifics of these theories, without a doubt, there's something bad going on, and they are roughly correct. I mean, we know the type of stimulatory measures the Chinese government is taking. So let's say you slightly doubt the Austrian business cycle theory and the idea of malinvestment that would be caused by such stimulatory measures. Let's say you doubted that. This is a very good piece of data to prove to you that there is some truth in it and it's happening. I'm not saying that that tells us what our US policy should be with respect to the Federal Reserve. We can debate those specifics, but at least there's how else would this have happened? This is such an absurd thing to happen. Just think about that as we watch this video.
Little ghost cities and ghost villages dotting the landscape. Let's head on to Shandong province next, and as you can see, right near the big city of Qingdao, as we rode our motorcycles through completely empty husks of buildings in another ghost city.
Completely empty cities where everything is basically unfinished. These are investment properties that people are buying, and people are buying as much of these as they can.
These things dot the landscape all over China.
like, to be clear, just to be clear, there were actual builders that went to these areas of land and they built roads going in and out. They built all these structures. They had humans work on this. They spent time, and thousands of people or millions of people in aggregate contributed to these giant efforts. And it's literally pointless. It was literally pointless. Nobody is there. Nobody uses it. It's complete waste of time. And this is super common. This is all over the place. They've already shown 3 locations. Let's keep watching though, because I think they're going to show more details at some point.
How about Guangdong province, where both myself and Matthew lived for the majority of our time in China? Here in Huizhou, you can once again see more ghost cities that we used to visit from time to time. And of course, probably the most famous ghost city in China, Ordos, up in Inner Mongolia. Well, here you can see some of the photos I snapped as I went around the town, seeing all the Mongolian motifs and beautiful but empty, eerie, and soulless buildings, complexes, shopping malls, and housing estates.
Well, there are some people in this one, but I think he said this was a famous one. So if you doubt it, you should Google it. This is real stuff.
If you take a step back and actually look at the map, these are just the ghost cities that we have personally visited. We have seen more during our travels, but didn't have time to film, or were passing by, or whatever the case may be. The thing is, I think you get the picture. These ghost cities are all over China, and I'm going to tell you why they're so important and why the Chinese government has to lie to you and its own citizens in order to prevent the massive economic collapse that so many economists have wrongly predicted up until this point. It always baffled me how ridiculously over the top the cost of apartments in China were. I lived in quite a few different apartments, and although the rent was reasonable, and actually very cheap by international standards, the amount that these apartments were worth was just ridiculous, sometimes millions of US dollars. Well, it turns out that about 70% of China's wealth is stashed away in real estate, and well, it's pretty easy to understand why. As an ordinary Chinese person, your investment opportunities are very, very limited and also extremely risky.
Now, I just want to kind of put you in the shoes of a Chinese person. Now, imagine this was you. Imagine that you put 70% of your savings into like an index fund, like the S&P 500. So you've saved for retirement, you've saved a certain amount, and you want to maybe pass some stuff on to your kids, you want to do this or that in the future, you've saved. Everyone has to do it. Now, 70% of what you've saved, imagine, goes to zero, or it goes to like a very small number, basically zero. Now you are going to have been completely you'll be completely ruined. That is not enough money. Unless you just saved way more than you needed to, you are going to be completely screwed. And even if you save way more than you needed to, you're not going to be able to have that type of extravagance in the future that you would have expected. And what you would have done had you known that you actually have, had you known that you actually have 70% less money than you actually do, like you thought you had $100, now you only have $30, you probably would have consumed less in all the years leading up to that point. You would have budgeted more, and you would have put even more money into the investment, so that in the future you would have, when it goes down from 70%, it would be 70% of a higher number, so you'd have more in the future, because you wouldn't even be able to probably meet your basic requirements with a 70% deduction in the value. So this is a huge crushing blow. And basically what it means is that people in the Chinese economy were over consuming in the present. They should have actually budgeted more, consumed less, so that they would be better off in the future, since they're going to take such a hit. And by the way, 70%, I mean, that's just this real estate thing. That's not even taking into account all the other problems in their economy. And so even that other 30% is not going to remain intact. So, and like, you know, you're getting paid, you have this nominal value of what you're getting paid, but in reality, due to the capital controls, that actual excess income is not nearly as valuable as you think. On paper, it's worth a lot because the marginal person is willing to, you know, trade for that. But you're not able to go, you know, to foreign markets, and you're not actually able to exit your position. You're holding a lot of yuan. You can't exit your position. There may be a marginal, you know, English banker who will do a forex, you know, trade and buy your yuan and give you pounds, and you can, or whatever, right? That might exist, but you as a person in China can't do that. So this is absolutely crushing. Basically, you know, you see here, people are just funneling all this money into these projects. They're not just putting money, it's not just on paper, but they're actually spending effort to build these things. They're literally constructing these thousands of skyscrapers. They're doing all of this stuff. And yeah, it's they're wasting real world resources. They're over levered. Their portfolios are going to collapse at some point. I mean, there's no way you can say this is sustainable. Like, come on. There's just no counter argument to this.
The stock market has crashed several times, and the Chinese government randomly steps in and freezes, delists, meddles, and does whatever it wants in the stock market whenever it sees fit. I mean, we saw this with the whole Didi debacle and the Alibaba nonsense with Jack Ma disappearing, just to mention a few of the things they've done. Bitcoin is illegal, and all other means of investment are either not available to your average Chinese citizen or completely unappealing to your average person on the street. There is, however, one asset class that has never, ever faltered and has never, ever been unreliable, and that is Chinese real estate. You are and have been guaranteed for decades in China that if you buy an apartment, no matter how shoddily constructed, some fool is going to come along and buy it from you at a large profit. You can't go wrong. Buy an apartment, sit on it for a few years, sell it, make loads of cash, buy more apartments, sit on them, sell them for loads of profit. Rinse and repeat. It's a
So basically, through this system, people are spending time making investments, and they are doing this thing where they're shuffling around real estate, and they're buying and selling and flipping and holding and doing all this stuff. They're just doing all this stuff, and they're getting money. But they didn't deserve money. They didn't do anything productive. So you are taking people that happen to be participating in this system and rewarding them with capital that they never did anything for. They didn't add any value. If you buy these stupid apartments, hold them for 3 years and sell them again, this is not something that should be rewarded en masse. But in fact, the entire population is just shuffling around these worthless apartments on paper. And it's just a giant Ponzi scheme. More money's coming in there, and the government is funneling investment, keeping things going, doing accounting tricks to make sure that everything stays solvent as long as they can keep that up. And then from there, they are, people are just basically taking the payout. They're buying an apartment, they're selling it, they're getting the cash, and they're just getting rewarded for that. And they just do it again and again. And it just keeps going until at some point, there's a set of people who are left holding the bag. There's the people who, when it all collapses, whoever owns these properties is going to be screwed. And unfortunately, it's kind of the case that there's not really any other options for people to put their money in. So it's not even like you can be smart and exit real estate and then go into another, another asset. You don't have that choice. The capital controls are so tight. You're kind of forced into this position. But nevertheless, this is not something that's sustainable. You can't just keep rewarding people for doing this. You can't. The profits have to come from somewhere. You have to pull it from a productive use of resources, and at some point, you can no longer do that. So let's keep watching.
Foolproof investment and a great retirement fund in a country that lacks even the most basic social programs. Of course, there's traditional significance to owning a house too, like the fact that if you want to get married, you have to show that you're a stable man and you have to have a house at the very least before you propose.
Well, there's another problem actually that comes from the gender imbalance in China. We'll talk about that.
The thing is, people are sinking their savings into real estate, and it's not the house they live in. Of course, if you can afford a house and you buy the house, well, when I say house, I'm talking about an apartment. You don't own the land, and it's actually only a 70-year lease. It's kind of a ridiculous situation. But anyway, you own that. But
so that's even worse. You actually don't own anything, and it's all going to be confiscated. So all this money is for these very short options of using something that is not even going to be used.
if you want to really make an investment, you need to invest in further.
It's like, think about how long ago this type of a scheme started, and then do the math and realize that the fact that this is built on not even owning anything, if you can't own something, you're not even owning it, you're just using it, you're leasing it for 30 years, or 70 years or 99 years. I think in Hong Kong it's 99. And that hasn't even happened yet. So there's literally 0% of this housing bubble has faced this imminent deadline. So it's so not in touch with reality. Like if the lease only lasted 5 years, this thing would have already been over because everything would have been confiscated. But what's going to happen when we hit those 70-year marks? Like how are they going to resolve this? It's going to be very interesting. It's so out of touch with reality.
Property. So in other words, you have to buy another apartment. And usually this is where the ghost cities come in. You see, owning a property in the cities is incredibly expensive. And for your average person, they just have to scrape by just to pay their rent or to pay for the apartment that they live in. Now, for your investment property or investment apartment, you need a cheaper option. So that's why they build these ghost cities out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody wants to go live there. It's far-flung. It's like an hour or two's drive out of the city to get there at the very least. But that's why the apartments are affordable. And that's why people invest in them, because they're affordable. Because, don't forget, in China, you buy an apartment, it doesn't matter where it is, the price is only going to go up, right? And that's why they create these ghost cities. And nobody goes and lives in them. They just buy and invest in them. And the thing is, once you've bought your investment property and you're not going to live in it, well, there's no point in doing anything to it. There's no point in installing plumbing or electricity, flooring, walls, windows, anything like that. In fact, investment properties around China in general are just complete husks that look like they're under construction still or part of a construction site. And there's a very good reason for this. And the reason is that if you were to spend the money to do all the decoration, to put in the plumbing, to put in the flooring, to put in the walls and everything else that goes along with it, the value of the apartment would actually go down. And this has got to do with Chinese traditional beliefs that if you buy an apartment that's already fully furnished and all set up, you will then be taking on the previous person's bad karma or bad juju or bad feng shui. So the whole thing is, if you buy an apartment and it is already decked out with decoration, you're going to knock that stuff out anyway and start fresh. So it's going to cost you money to basically destroy what's there and start from the beginning. So if you start with an empty shell, it's worth more to you.
Well, the way that's framed is wild. I don't want to be in any way judgmental on Chinese culture. I personally do like the idea of starting fresh, so I don't want to criticize that. But this is just so fascinating. And so let me now. I think we've watched enough of this. I think this was interesting. I'm going to save this to the sources playlist on my channel. So, always keep up with what's going on over there. This was fascinating. But I want to talk a little bit more about some of the other problems that China faces. And this is stuff that Zeihan has talked about a lot. A lot of people have talked about this stuff. And I'm not going to go, because we can spend all day deep diving on everything that he has to say. And he's written multiple books and so on. So I don't want to get too caught in the weeds on this. I want to give you the high level. But there's a lot of other problems that China faces. And I will categorize them in several ways. So, okay, first of all, there's demographics. So the demographics problem is twofold. First is they had this thing called the one-child policy. Now, this was really bad for a variety of reasons. The issue is they were worried about overpopulation at one point. So they restricted parents to only be able to have one child. And this created an unsustainable demographic structure where there were way less young people than old people, because basically some people have no children, and then people who do have children, there's two parents, and then for each parent there's one child, or for each pair there's one. So if you just took, each parent, there's two parents and then one child, just by itself, that would cut the population in half once the parents die. But actually, not everybody has kids, so that's even less than half, because some parents don't end up having kids. And that's just really bad. And so what happens is what you need to have is there's like a replacement rate where you need to actually have multiple children per family in order to have a sustainable population. And what happens is, again, we can go into Peter Zeihan's theories on this, and there's a lot of thinking and evidence about why demographics matter. But basically, when you get this inverted pyramid where there's a ton of old people and very few young people, this is very bad, because what happens is the old people retire. Now there's nobody to fill their space in the labor force, and they basically are no longer productive, and now they need to be essentially fed and taken care of, and it's just the original population of youth cannot support that, and it's a sign of economic collapse. It's very well established that these declining demographic structures are very bad for economic prosperity. And essentially what you want is a growing population with a lot of young people that are coming into the labor force and consuming and saving and being productive and having kids, and then those kids come in and they just keep the population grows, and then so does the economy. That is what you want. And instead they have the inverse. Now it's even worse than how I painted it, because they also have a gender imbalance. So with the one-child policy, a lot of families preferred to have boys instead of girls. So they would kill the girls if they had a girl. And so there's actually like an excess of men relative to women. And so women are the ones who dictate the rate of population more so than men. That's like the limiting factor on how many kids we can have. So on top of all of that, the fact that you can only have one kid for a long period of time. So there was just way less kids. Not everybody had kids. And then on top of that, now it's like, now there's very few women relative to men. So now there's a lot of angry men who are not going to ever find anybody. They can't leave the country. There's capital controls. They can't do any, they're stuck where they are. And there's women, and there's just way less women. And yes, now technically they can have more kids, but they've reversed this policy after so much time that there's virtually no way possible that this trend can reverse. Essentially, the economy, the Chinese economy, is on this road to demographic collapse. And so I really recommend, this is like Peter Zeihan's main thesis, this stuff about the housing. This is actually just a sideshow. I recommend, if you're very interested in this, you should go and look at his materials just on your own time and look into this. It's very concerning. And the way I like to think about this, I actually have a mental model for thinking about this. And that model is that I like to think about a population as a kind of a multi-core computer. And each person has like a neural engine that's one core in this giant distributed system, this computer. And so the more people that you have, in a sense, the more productive people that you have, the more you are able to compute. And so, like, just think about how you can, as you have a larger computer, you can train a better AI model because you're able to run more iterations of training and store more data and basically do more back propagation and find the weights of the model, of a larger model, and do all of that. Just as that scales, it's the same thing for human productivity in the economy. The more people you have, the more you can distribute a workload. You can, if you have an abundance of labor, you're able to, labor is not as scarce and you can apply it to more things. So if you need someone to figure out this one type of problem, now that person can specialize in this one thing and they just do this one thing and they do it really well. And you get these kind of accumulative effects of having lots of different people. And you can think of this as like a distributed system where more people is way more productive. And like one kind of like tangential thought experiment that I have is, why is Elon Musk so insanely productive? And why is he so good at getting things done and doing things? Now, a lot of it has to do with the fact that he's very smart, he's very focused, and his personality. We have to give him that. And he's a great engineer. He knows physics well, and he has all those qualities. But people say, oh, is he the greatest engineer ever? I mean, he's definitely led the best initiatives ever for engineering teams. These rockets to SpaceX, Starlink, Tesla, self-driving, XAI, just everything. I mean, this is all incredible, everything that he's done. Neuralink, I'm just forgetting the things that are so good. But how could he have achieved that? How did he do that? Really, the truth is, yes, he is a good engineer and he works hard, and you can go down the list of good qualities. But his real, where he really shines is in his ability to get other top tier engineers to work really hard. He's a motivator. He goes in to a room with other top tier engineers, he inspires them, and he pushes them to work harder than they could ever imagine. He's able to do this really well at scale. He's a very good communicator. Now, not in the traditional sense. People think he's not very eloquent. They criticize when he gives speeches, political speeches, etc. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying he's a very effective communicator to engineers in the context of business. And he is a hyper motivating individual. And this is also, Steve Jobs was very good at this too. That's why these people have been able to achieve so much, is because they've been able to harness human capital very well. They've been able to essentially program a collection of humans to distribute a workload very well and kind of like overclock their processors, for lack of a better analogy. And that's also, I think, I want to do a episode on IQ. I need to do a little more research on this, but Nassim Taleb has kind of debunked some IQ things. I guess basically when you start getting to, I think 2 standard deviations or no, maybe less than that. Point is, when you get to extreme IQ values, it stops being very predictive. So like a 160 IQ doesn't tell you as much as you think it does. Now, someone having like a 120 IQ versus 110 IQ or 90 IQ, like this is more useful. But when you start getting to extreme values, it starts becoming less predictive. But that's not my point. There is another important aspect of IQ, which is the fact that really it's not that correlated to success in the real world, like in business and financially. There's some connection, but it's not super strong. And you'd think that it would just be simply true that the smartest person, the person who's able to do the most calculations in their head and all these things that IQ does, you would just simply think that they would just be the richest because they could just figure stuff out, and this raw intelligence would just help them so much. But really, there's a lot of other things that are way better predictors of wealth and success. And part of it is EQ, which is also hard to measure, and like good looks, and basically social things are very important. And I also think, like, my hypothesis is if you dived into like the verbal side of IQ, I think there'd probably be a higher payoff in terms of like how helpful that is. Because at the end of the day, like coordinating amongst people is really the high level task that has the highest payoff. Like doing calculations, in some sense, you're just a glorified calculator if that's all you can do. And I don't mean to diminish people who pride themselves on their ability to do that. I'm just saying it's simply not the highest value piece of the pie. That's just the truth of it. So your ability to coordinate and communicate with others is demonstrably the most important piece of determining your success. And that's because essentially humans are able to like interlink our minds and communicate. We have this conscious experience and we have language, and we're able to communicate and offload labor from one person to another. And that's how humans evolved in the ancestral environment. We hunted in groups and we coordinated, and that's how we developed our brains. And there's a lot of research that substantiates this. And so instead of keeping it all in here, we are able to share a workload and have like a distributed process. And so another time we can go fully into that theory. But all that is to say that this is why fundamentally it's very bad to have lower population. The more population you have, assuming that you have a good system in place for governance, the higher your population, the higher your computational power is, and basically the more that you can have people hyper specialize and iterate on solutions that all come together and collaborate in a market. And a market is a decentralized coordination mechanism. And so like in the case of the United States, if we have a large population, unless somehow that comes with a large amount of political turmoil, which is possible. But with a large population, people are able to try new things, innovate, create new ventures, work for companies, come to private understandings and arrangements and do business, and basically try a bunch of different things. And through a market mechanism, those that succeed will be elevated, and those that fail will be taken, will take resources from them. And through this decentralized weighing process, we are essentially allocating resources to the people who are best able to handle it. But also, it's not necessarily like, here's the thing that I want people to understand is it's not always about how good the individual person is or let's say you see a very successful business or a very successful entrepreneur or person. It's not always about their qualities. It's kind of about the system that brought them about. So for example, DeepSeek is very cool. They have some really smart people, and they did some really cool things. I would caution anyone who is taking too many lessons from this specific example. And the reason I would caution that is because what you're doing is you're kind of missing the forest for the trees. The tree in this case would be OpenAI is a tree, and then DeepSeek is a tree. And you're focusing on that tree. You're like, look at this tree. It's so cool. But you're missing the forest. You're inside of a competitive landscape. And in that competitive landscape, what's happening is there's a search process that's occurring. And so there's all this trial and error where there's people that are using resources and they're trying to basically take a stab at solving AI problems. Now, when you have lots of people trying, like if you have one team trying, they'll try 100 things and maybe one of them pays off. If you have 10 teams, they each try 100 things. Now you've tried 1,000 things, and now maybe 10 things pay off. And you see how, and then if you are kind of cross-pollinating and sharing knowledge and competing and showing each other what works, now you're building off of each other's successes, and you see how you can start getting this compounded growth. And also what this does is, the market also can like reallocate resources. So when there's someone who is competent, the market can fund them. They've demonstrated that they're not going to completely waste the money. Now the market will give them some money to play with. Now, if they've demonstrated they've used that well, they'll give them more money. And it kind of scales this up in proportionally to how much you can really trust them to be a good steward of resources. And those that just have failed, they're going to have a much harder time. It's not impossible, but it's just a harder time. They're going to have to show why they deserve that capital. It's a great system. And so we have like a certain number of labs, and very few of them are focused on efficiency. So it makes sense that DeepSeek found these breakthroughs that were obviously there to be found. This is nothing that was revolutionary. But so they're smart. Congratulations to them. A lot of people wouldn't have been able to do that. But it's also, when you look at the process of just basically, you have a bunch of teams iterating on this problem, searching for solutions, you're going to expect someone to find these things. This is just what you would expect. And so one of the issues in relation to DeepSeek in particular is that China has a centrally planned economy. Not 100%, but there's a lot of, the government has a very heavy hand. And so the government is going to now kind of have a choice. They're going to either not fund, there's maybe three choices. One is to just go hands-off free market. That would be ideal for them. If they can manage that, there's issues that arise from going that route though on the path that they're on. But let's say that they want to control the amount of investment going into AI, and they notice DeepSeek is an important team, so they want to control that investment. They're going to decide on some amount to give DeepSeek. And so this is going to be either, it's possible they can give them just the right amount of money, but it's actually very hard to determine what that is. And odds are, on any given one-time funding event, the amount given is probably wrong. Now, in aggregate, the market is going to, over time, fund people on average to the right amount, and this will work out. So maybe someone gets overfunded, they squander resources, they're directionless. Another team's underfunded, they can't pull it off even though they had the potential. There's both of those things are going to happen in the market, but since there's many different shots on goal, maybe someone is going to get the right amount of funding. But what China now has to do is they need to decide how much are they going to back DeepSeek. This is in their economy. It's their choice. What are they going to do to back DeepSeek? Are they going to just ignore them, underfund them, do nothing, just focus on their existing labs? That probably would be a mistake because they're super talented. They deserve funding. Are they going to let them, or are they going to like go all in, say these are our stars, let's fund them? That could also be a mistake, because maybe they would be, perhaps they can enable DeepSeek to continue innovating in AI if they do that. But on the other hand, they may be massively over allocating resources that should be going elsewhere in the economy. And this is just one of many of such cases that would in aggregate have a very harmful effect on what the future of China is going to look like, because they're just going to, if they keep overpaying for things, they're going to basically squander all their money on, like, it is possible to invest too much in AI research. Especially, you might think AI research is a very good area to invest, but one team is not necessarily able to efficiently allocate capital past a certain point. Like, you might know how to spend $1 million, but not $1 billion. And so when they try to do this and they do it in a suboptimal way, they're squandering resources. So fundamentally, this is just a very difficult thing that China's going to have to face. They're going to have to figure out what to do with DeepSeek, and there's no right answer. The right answer is to have a competitive market that takes many shots on goal and allows private firms to come in and assess the opportunity and provide capital to entrepreneurs. And, just the market is a decentralized system for allocating resources, and it's super effective and it compounds over time. Now, on the other hand, China is highly centralized. I don't want to say it's not like a full communist, like Russian, Soviet communist. I'm not saying that, but it is highly centralized. And so there are a lot of problems with central planning. This has been proven time and time again throughout world history. You can just look at the examples where central planning does not work. And they always say, oh, this time it's different. This time will be scientific. This time the technology will help us. Like, this is always what communists have always said throughout history. And it's never been true because it's just fundamentally too hard. And I mean, you even see this with large companies. Large companies are not able to innovate in the same way that small companies are, because as you start managing a larger amount of resources, your ability to manage those resources well diminishes. And there's a lot of things that start getting at you. Like, you're going to have lots of vendors basically slacking. If you have a million different vendors that you're working with, right? Some of them might not do their job on time, and they're going to get away with it because you're not able to monitor all 1 million vendors and stuff like that. So the bigger you get, the more bloat you have, the harder it is to manage, the more you need bureaucracy. And it just basically weighs it down, and it makes it impossible to make these decisions. And at the end of the day, some things are just unknowable. And what you want is a variety of different stances to be taken in the economy. You want some people to bet one way and some people to bet another way. And you know that when this happens, some people will win and some people will lose. And that's what the market does. It's constantly weighing these decisions and reallocating resources. And so that works. And when you have a restructuring in the private sector, it's just not so bad. It's painful for those involved, but at the end of the day, it's very painless for the population as a whole. Now, when this is the government is the one making these critical decisions that you can't know the answer to, when it collapses, it literally erodes the foundation of society, and it's very catastrophic. So there's a lot of reasons why central planning doesn't work. Again, we were watching Mises Institute video. You should go look at what Hayek and Mises and Rothbard have said about the problems of central planning. This is a very interesting topic. I've also done some work on this, and I'll do more videos another time going into this. But fundamentally, I want to return to this point, but what I want to say is that this is a problem with what something like what Balaji Srinivasan says. And we will go back and we're going to listen to what he says. We're going to read what he says about China. He thinks that China is a threat to the U.S. and we need to, get our act together. Otherwise, they're going to beat us. And he's a libertarian. So the thing is I say, Balaji, you are not being libertarian enough on this. It's like, it almost, I know I'm not at all actually, I'm teasing you and pushing you here. This is not serious, but it's like almost like, Balaji, you are not committed enough. Like, you don't actually believe that libertarianism is the best system and capitalism is the best system. Like, you don't actually believe that. You're not even really a libertarian if you think that such a centrally planned economy is possibly able to overtake, under any context, a free market, essentially. And we can say it's not really a free market, but come on, it's way freer. It's not in any sense comparable to the degree of centralization that is in the Chinese system. And so that's my main contention with Balaji on this. I just think he's not seriously, I think he's trying to make a rhetorical point and evoke an emotional reaction from people who don't want China to beat the US, but I don't see how he could actually believe that they would do that. And I don't think that his arguments hold up when we actually look at them. But before we dive into that, there's one other thing I wanted to say. Now, as an extension of, we have this giant financial bubble of a historic malinvestment of historic proportions, building unprecedented levels of infrastructure, that useless infrastructure and housing that nobody needs, that have wasted real resources, wasted real time, distorted behaviors, and that's going to ultimately collapse the entire economy. We have that's the first problem China faces. The second problem China faces, and we have like evidence, like video evidence, photo evidence of this, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's just this is so obvious that you cannot argue with this. Like, come on, like don't even try. The second thing is the demographic collapse. I didn't go too deep into this. This is absolutely devastating. Having the population collapse is going to completely destroy the economy in its own right. It's going to be devastating. Peter Zeihan has done a lot of good stuff on this. If you guys want me, I can leave a comment. I can cover this, but just go research this on your own. And then it's centrally planned, not fully, but there's a large degree of central planning. And it's an authoritarian dictatorship. And it's such a big economy. I mean, how the heck are they going to be able to actually do this? I mean, that never works. Central planning never works. And so we just kind of from first principles, even just by knowing the degree of central planning that goes on in China, the fact that the state is like saying, let's build these railroads and these bridges and these power plants and these shipyards and all this stuff, like the government is deciding these things instead of the private sector. You know that this is going to be bad decisions just out of principle, based on how that works. So that's really bad. And then also politically, this is something that Peter Zeihan also talked about. China has insulated itself, like internally, like the leadership of China has insulated itself. So Xi Jinping is basically put on a throne, and he's basically taken out all of his rivals and potential rivals. And anyone who goes against him or produces any sort of work that could discredit him, whether or not that work is true, maybe publishing accurate data or something along those lines, anyone who does that is taken out. So now he has no information, that he has not no information, but the information that flows to him is highly censored, highly inaccurate, and basically he is now consuming his own propaganda. Propaganda is fine. You might need to convince someone to believe a certain thing, but if you are literally listening to your own propaganda and believing that it's true, you're screwed. And if you're the central planner, you're screwed. That's not going to work. There's nobody there that can tell him the truth. There's nobody there that can put an opposing viewpoint and stand up to him and oppose him in any way. And he's basically making giant decisions and trying to manage this entire economy. And we know that that doesn't work because we know the results of central planning. And we know the theoretical problems of central planning. And we see historic levels of malinvestment and overspending on useless infrastructure that wastes real resources. And we know, resulting in a bubble, and the population is absolutely collapsing. People have not had kids, and it's just all going to shit. It's just a fact. And so now there are people who disagree. And I love Balaji Srinivasan. I love him. He's such a brilliant thinker, so inspiring, but he's wrong on this. I want to show you the type of stuff that he talks about as evidence for China being good. And I'm only showing you some things he says. So don't judge him. I'm not trying to make him the villain here. I really like him, actually. So don't think that I'm trying to exclude certain things that he says or mislead you to believe. I'm not trying to characterize his views. I'm just using him as an example. And I think he would agree with me on this. So I just searched Balaji China on X, And so this is the kind of stuff that he shows. Let me make this a little bit less big. I was making it I was making it big so you could read it, but now I want to show you the video. Make it a little less big again. Okay. Can you see this? Yes, you can. Okay. So this is his kind of example of, look at all these amazing cities. This is what Chinese cities look like. We can deny that they are ahead, or we can build startup cities to get back in the game. Like, look at, oh, wow, these trains and these lights and these structures. And you look at this. Wow, it's so beautiful. It truly is amazing. Like, I'm not doubting this. This is absolutely true. Like, look at this. That's actually insane. It's so cool. I mean, on one hand, it's just LEDs, but on the other hand, it's so cool. I mean, there's real trains and real stuff. So, it's very cool. Like, clearly, let's see what else he talks about. They can build a train station in 9 hours, and we can't build it. I mean, this is a good point. I think this is a good point. Okay, let's see. This is about rare earth minerals. Okay, here, this is better. China, #1 in steel, #1 in trade, #1 in shipbuilding, #1 in high-speed rail. Like, let's look at this. They have all this high-speed rail. Like, wow, so much infrastructures. This is amazing. All this infrastructure, all these ships. They built all these ships. Wow. There's all these, they have shipbuilding capacity, so they have factories to build ships. That's infrastructure. So, look, there's merit to this. Like, I'm not saying that there's no merit, but don't you see that this is exactly what people, if you predicted what is the grandest malinvestment in infrastructure known to man, what would it look like? It would look like this. It would look like these amazing cities and all these high-speed rails connecting all these locations and all these factories that could build a bajillion ships and all this stuff. Exactly what he's describing. That's what it would look like if Peter Zeihan was right. A malinvestment of epic proportions. It would look just like this. And of course, maybe also you would say, well, also a genuinely good economy would look like this too. And that's true. But when you realize that, like, this is not the most productive workers in the world, this is not the most wealthiest people, not the most well-educated people. This is not a bash. Like, this is not a personal insult. Like, do not confuse this. I'm just really talking from a purely academic standpoint. That this is still an overall relatively poor developing country. And they have all these high-speed rails connecting some cities that are genuinely good, but a lot of cities that are just simply, there's nothing of note going on there. So it's possible that this could have some payoff, but you have to weigh the return on investment when you do things like this, and look at how absurdly hard they've gone on building high-speed rail. Like, it's great, but they've pushed it to the max. They've done it like, this is like the most epic high-speed rail like project of all history, of all human history. Like, this is like beyond cool. But it's like, was this needed? Was this the right allocation of resources? This is what you would expect. I mean, you're connecting like fishing villages and stuff. Like, that is not match. It doesn't match. Something's not right. And we know all this other stuff's happening, and we see all the economic data and demographic data to support this. It's true that it could be a sign. You see a cool city, you can see that it's a sign of something good going on. It's true. But also, if what Peter Zeihan was saying was right, this is what you would expect. You would expect a giant infrastructure buildup. And to be honest, I think there's something to be said for inefficiency. Getting wealth in some ways does create inefficiency. It does in some ways create like foster NIMBYism. People are a bit more conservative when they're well off. And if you were to have a massive infrastructure and real estate bubble of epic proportions, you would expect it to be very flashy. And this is not crazy. This is like the kind of thing that you would expect. So it would be, lots of lights and aesthetics, but not a lot of functionality. So when I see this, I'm both happy for the people who live there to live in a cool city, and I'm also kind of sad because this just may not be what they really wanted, or maybe what they would have really benefited from. And they might have just been better off if things were allocated by a market instead of fueled by government controlling capital flows. And so anyway, thank you so much. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this, please subscribe. I do content like this all the time, every single day. I do multi-hour streams, so you'll never run out of intellectually stimulating content that covers tech and its impact on society. And I like to just figure out what is the right way of thinking about things and share my mental models